mentioned, we had a ton of registrants, and I think we've also trained some people to register so they know that they get noticed when it gets archived and they just watch it on the archive. But it certainly is, a hot topic. It always has been, and I suppose it always will be. Although I guess, we've had a mission since we've started to try to diminish the discussion around food and beverage, especially pertaining to finance in the boardroom. So what we're doing in today's webinar, there's a lot of slides to go through, but some of them we're going to go through very quickly. I think we'll probably be about 40 minutes to finish this up, and obviously I want to leave some time for questions as well. But lately we've adopted a case study format to some of these webinars, and so what we're actually doing is we're taking real life scenarios with real clubs. These are things that we try to pick case studies that people run into quite a bit. Obviously, there's always a little bit of variation from club to club, but this particular topic, always a high interest. Basically, the F&B check, what we're calling it F&B reality check. It's getting around that discussion in the boardroom that happens too often around boards believing that food and beverage is a significant driver of the overall finances of the club. And that assumption often leads to a consumption of precious board time and a forced focus on the part of the management team that doesn't always put the club in the best position relative to long-term delivery of a strong value proposition at the club. So that's what we're talking about. So this is a real club we're talking about. This is we kind of got involved in this club a while back, and this was an email that we saw come from the club, and so we said this is a perfect scenario. Everyone's club scenario might be a little bit different, but the goal of today in discussing food and beverage and the subsidy, and we all know the type of discussion that happens in the boardroom. The goal is not to obviously tell you all how to make money in food and beverage, right? I mean, that's not what this is about. What this is about is looking at a club that had this scenario, running through what was the actual scenario of the club, and how should where should the board's discussion have been focused on versus focused on food and beverage? Because I'm a believer that we can't just get boards away from talking about food and beverage because we just tell them it's an amenity. It's going to take more than that. And I think the most effective way we've seen is to show them that relative to the things they need to be concerned about, food and beverage finances is very, very low on the list. And until we can explain and prove that to them, they generally don't believe it, just because they've got a fundamental view of, since it's so much of it's 30% of the revenue of the club, therefore it must be financially important. So we're going to talk about guiding the conversation with the right information. So it's a redirection of their focus through education is really what this webinar is all about, and how we bring clubs away from what we call the F&B trap. So this is really ultimately a discussion around being able to explain the business, and we're going to focus on this one. But in order to give the relative importance or unimportance of any one facet, you kind of have to say, well, what is going on in the club? And now let's look at food and beverage in context. So that's what we're going to talk about. But this was kind of the kickoff. I mean, this is a real clip from an email that came from a real general manager. And frankly, I think anyone that's on this webinar and has been in this industry for a while has probably seen these kind of emails quite a bit. Here at ABC Golf, and obviously we're hiding the name, right? Golf and Country Club, we're having the age-old debate about private clubs and why our food and beverage operation does not can't make money like McDonald's does. Of all things, it's not even like Ruth's Chris does, but it's like McDonald's does. In the past, we've subsidized $85,000 in food and beverage. I would graciously appreciate if you'd be willing to share your subsidy level or profit if applicable. So that literally was the request that went out, and so what you get back, and we're going to show you, you ask for a list of numbers and you get back a list of numbers. There's no context, there's no insight, there's no information. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of use that as a little bit of a backdrop theme. We're going to start there and then weave away from it and come back to it. But what we're really ultimately going to talking about is using the right data, in this case around food and beverage, and around the whole club, to redirect, not just fight, right? You can't. It's kind of the yin and yang thing where you can't just push against it. You have to redirect. So there's a little bit of, this is like food and beverage jujitsu, right? So you have to redirect the energy, not necessarily push blunt force against it. And I think that's actually kind of a nice analogy I just thought of. But there's one quote here I found a few weeks ago, and it plays through the theme. When you can measure what you were speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it, but when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. Any of you that remember your old science classes, the name Kelvin, Lord Kelvin was the one that came up with the Kelvin temperature scale back in the 1800s. He was a Scottish physicist. But, we have to, so things like, why can't we make money in food and beverage, right? That's not, there's no knowledge around numbers or what that means or context around that. So we're going to try to fix that a little bit by applying, the combination of data, knowledge, and insight. This one applies directly, right? Far better an approximate answer to the right question than an exact answer to the wrong question. The fact that, probably 80% of board members in the country could give you the exact answer as to what their cost of food is, but none of them could give you, any approximation of the right answer to, does this club generate the capital it needs, and how do we know? One is the right question. Clearly, they don't have the answer for. One is the wrong question, but they know that answer exactly. That's the mode we have to get out of relative to F&B. And then not nearly as an esteemed group of people, but I like to say you can't understand any one club without studying the industry, and you can't understand the industry by studying only one club. And so that's what this is all about. And so you can't apply context and insight until you're able to look across a spectrum of clubs. So I don't want to take too long on the setup here, but basically the themes for our session is, it's not necessarily only the board's fault. We're trying to, fix the problem that they keep harping on food and beverage. We have to all be able to explain the business to our boards, and explaining the business is about redirecting, so that's not the exact answer to the wrong question, but it's at least the approximate answer to the right question. One of the other themes I want you to think about in this is I think about clubs like I do any business, the notion of product lines, and the product lines have very different roles in clubs. And so just very simply, in the world of clubs with golf, you have dues, which is a product line. You have food and beverage, which is a product line. You have golf operations, which is a product line. And dues is a very high margin product line, right? It's 100% margin. There's no cost with dues. Golf operations is somewhere in the middle, right? There's a lot of good margin that comes out of golf operations, especially for things like guest greens fees. Food and beverage is a product line that has an extremely low, frankly, negative margin. And so like any business, the goal is to say, well, typically loss leader product lines, they still perform an important function, right? Why does, milk sell at a loss for supermarkets? Because they know when they put a sale on milk, it drives people in and they spend the $100 and eat on other things. Why does Gillette lose money on the handle and only make money on the blade? If you sell the handle, they're going to buy the blades. So you have to sort of look at the club as a series of product lines, and then managing the product line so that ultimately you can fund your operations through the margin. And then finally, the final theme is this data versus information versus knowledge, and that will become apparent as we go through it. I've just kind of gone through that, but data is basically raw facts and figures. Information is, we apply some context to that. And then the knowledge is when you apply insight. And we're going to go, as we go through this, that will become apparent how those things weave through. I am moving quickly just because we try to keep these moving along. So I'm going to come back to this model in a minute, but what we're approaching specifically here today is the notion around food and beverage, and we saw the exact clip from an email, but we need to make money. Why don't we run like a restaurant? go figure out how much other clubs make. And if our answer is simply, but F&B is an amenity, that's still not an explanation. It might be technically true if you define an amenity as something that has expenses higher than the revenue that it brings in. And then in most cases it does fit that definition, but it's not an explanation. And so we're trying to explain, not just, explain and redirect in the case of the discussion in the boardroom, not just push against. So this is, so relative to the email snippet that we saw, which was real life, this was the set of numbers that was collected. Okay, here's whatever this is, 30 clubs. Here's the list of food and beverage results, anywhere from a loss of $563,000 to a gain of $334,000. Now, I actually used some of these slides. I taught at BMI 3 last week at Michigan State. I taught the financial management section for about 3 hours, and I used this. And of course, it was more fun in a room full of people. But I asked them, if this list were put up in front of your board, where would your board say, well, we want to be like that club, right? And of course, everyone says they would point to the $300,000 profit club, and people felt strongly that their board collectively would say, we want to figure out how to be like that club, how to be the club down here that makes $300,000 a year, not one of these clubs up here, because clearly they're mismanaged, right? Data, there's no context or insight yet. So let's tuck that aside. We're going to come back to that. What we're going to do right now is actually, I ran one of the key reports. So this, just to back up, a lot of folks on this webinar are club benchmarking members, and certainly some of the folks aren't, and that's okay. The charts we're going to look at, just so people get it, if you're a member, you can run these, obviously many others, but these are all right out of mostly the gross profit key performance indicator report. I've inserted a couple others as well, but they're all generatable by you all. And so everything I'm doing here today to tell the story of a club and hopefully redirect, you all can do. And for the folks that aren't members, this is the kind of thing that you can do. And obviously there's lots of information online about that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run through these slides quickly, and we'll surmise it at the end, but we're going to paint the story, tell the story of the club using numbers to explain the business, right? And all these numbers, they're not just a list of numbers, but they're arranged in a way, here's me in operating revenue, and here's the set of other operating revenues for the clubs we're looking at, and so we have some context about where we are, and we'll go into that. But basically, here's the operating revenue for the club, here's the capital income. So we already can see, all right, here's a club, one chart. We've learned, based on their size, that their capital income looks a little light, right? Because if it looked typical, and they were in the 47th percentile for revenue, they would also be at the 47th percentile for capital income. They're not. They're at the 34th. So, okay, we'll just tuck that aside as part of the story. This club has a gross margin of 58%. As we all know, in any business, gross margin is the money that you have to pay for your fixed operating expenses. Now, just to shoot back up, these are the fixed operating expenses that gross margin is used for in clubs, certainly in clubs with golf. It's the same thing. It's the same list of functions we use for every club in part of this model. So that's the money that's left to pay for all these functions, okay? And so what this means is, while it's a $4.8 million club, a 58% gross margin means it had about $2.8 million to pay for that list of things, okay? Which is typical. It's very close to the median, within a couple points. Where does that gross profit come from? We know in the industry about 80% from golf, from dues, about 15% from golf. This club, just notable, its contribution from golf is somewhat lower. So we'll revisit that in a minute. Again, we're just still telling the overall story. Dues ratio, the dues engine is actually pretty strong. 54% of its operating revenue comes from dues. That's a good thing. 5 points higher than the median, roughly. Interestingly, we did see that low contribution, so a little more from dues, a little less from golf, and so I put a few charts in here just to say, interesting, because guest green fees, because clearly when clubs are going down the path of asking the question, why can't we make money in food and beverage? I mean, there's a question behind that, right? In their mind, we think we need more cash. Why isn't the club generating, enough margin, right? Can we get some margin out of food and beverage? And so, what you have to look at in the spirit of clubs having different product lines is, where does your margin come from? And we know margin, things like the margin on a guest green fee is very high. So the fact that their contribution from golf was low, let's look at that. Interesting. They do have a relatively low contribution of dollars from guest green fees, lower than you would expect for a club of their size. And the same for outings, very low. So, all right, we're just tucking this information aside right now. We're looking at what are the margin opportunities so that we can help redirect from maybe the wrong question to the right question, all right? And interestingly, the amount of money they spend on their fixed expenses is relatively low. So most clubs, their gross margin is 60% and their fixed expense ratio is 60%, meaning if they had $2.8 million to fund operating expenses, they spent $2.8 million on operating expenses. That's typical. Most of clubs are nonprofits. This club had a 58% gross margin and a 53% fixed expense ratio. That means they're underspending. That tells me, when you start to tell the story of the club, that this club is trying to squeeze cost, right? They're trying to have cost control, expense control, which is completely consistent with a club that is chasing food and beverage. Very typically, clubs that are chasing profit in food and beverage, they've got some financial strain, and as a result, they're not really generally addressing the big issue, but they're saying squeeze down costs and make money in food and beverage, right? That's the behavior that happens when the business isn't explained and they don't have the big picture. Drive food and beverage and try to make profit and squeeze down costs overall. And so that's what happens here. And obviously that, lower spending on those operating expenses can have an impact on member satisfaction. When we look at how they allocate across all their fixed operating expenses, I'm not going to go into all this, but there is one thing worthy of note. We're going to put that aside in a pin, which is, green is course maintenance and yellow is non-golf sports operational expenses. And we know this is about a $5 million club, and we can see the split in most $5 million clubs. And so fundamentally, this is a golf club. Right? I mean, this is a club that really has effectively close to zero spending on non-golf amenities. So that's very interesting, and I think there's a really big strategic question around that. So again, let's tuck that aside, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But it's part of the story that we're telling around this club. And because because we saw they had a 58% gross margin and a 53% spend of that gross margin, they in fact generated a positive operating result of about $220K. Now, if you remember, we saw that their capital income was light. Frankly, $390,000 of capital income for a $5 million club is very light. And so what's happening here? They're driving expense down, and they're saying things like, can we make money in food and beverage? Because they have to drive profit out of operations because they don't have enough capital income, right? So we're starting to tell the story a little bit deeper, which is, I wonder if their lack of capital income is driving a culture and behavior of deep cost control so that they can throw profit out of operations and in fact kick it over to the capital ledger side, right? That's what happens. So, $220,000 of operating profit. We saw their capital income of $391, and as those of you who know our models, when we develop the value of net available capital, which for this conversation is effectively their capital income plus their operating result, right? Because that operating result kicks over to the capital side. They end up with a $615,000 in net available capital, right? That's the money to pay down debt and reinvest back into the club or to put into the bank as cash reserves. So they end up with a net available capital, both as a dollar amount and as a ratio, net available capital ratio, which is, pretty good, not bad. The question is, how are they getting there and what behavior is driving them as we tell the story of this club? And it's really enabled through that reduced spending, right? They've cut back that spending on we saw that fixed expense ratio on all those 6 slices of the pie, which are the fixed operating expenses. They're driving those costs down in order to kick off some profit. Now, so let's now dive into food and beverage a little bit. So that we told the story of the club other than food and beverage, right? And we'll summarize it at the end. But food and beverage, it's a pretty big operation for a $5 million club, $1.8 million in revenue, and they've got a $76,000 loss. Okay, not a very high dollar loss, but we're going to measure this in a minute as a percentage. As we can see, it's a pretty darn typical, right, sort of in the middle of the industry. And generally, as your revenue goes higher, right, you lose more and more and more. So the fact that their revenue is a little higher and their losses is left on the curve, really, squeezing it. Now, most of you know that we use a ratio called net food and beverage as a percentage of gross profit. It puts food and beverage in context, right? Data is the list of, here's the 30 clubs, and here was their net loss or net profit on food and beverage. That has zero context to it. It's simply a list of numbers. Putting it in context, we do it in 2 ways here. One is we line them all up, and we know that 3/4 of the clubs lose money. Here's break even, right? Lose money in food and beverage. So that's one application of context. The second is their $76,000 of subsidy equates to 3% of their gross profit, which puts them right smack in the middle of the industry. So I have no doubt that when the board asked that question, they had no concept, A, of what does the industry look like in terms of results, and how do we look? They're looking at a $76,000 number. What does that mean? I mean, to Club A, 500,000 losses is meaningless. To Club B, 500,000 losses is devastating. And how much of your gross profit that equates to is something that puts that number in context. So they're right smack in the middle. And the real key point is it's 3% of their gross profit. The 97% of their gross profit is getting, none of this, where that's going is getting very little discussion, I believe is fact. And based on what's going on at this club, this 3% of their gross profit is consuming probably 50% of their board time. It's completely misguided. And this chart specifically is an important part of the redirection through putting things in context. So, again, their food and beverage revenue as a percentage of the club is higher. Another indicator of they've been pushing it, right? They're thinking if we get more people into dinner on Wednesday night, we can, we'll make money. Well, you don't make money, because if that was that simple, everybody would just have more people into dinner on Wednesday night. It's a product line. When, in our view, this is part opinion, part fact, the industry has sort of spoken, but when treated in a way that is intended to deliver a high value proposition experience, expenses are not covered by revenue in that department. Now, you can drive it down. I mean, I can tell everybody get their pen out, right? I can tell you in the next 10 seconds, I'm going to tell you how every club listening can make money on food and beverage, because this is just math. Ready? All you have to do is run it at a 50% labor ratio. Done. 50% labor, 42% cost of food, 92% cost, 8% margin on every dollar, right? Now, is that the right thing to do? No, in our view, it's the exact wrong thing to do, because members are not going to be satisfied with a 50% service defined by a 50% labor ratio. Nor should they, especially for the clubs where you've paid a significant initiation fee, nor should your expectations should be higher, right? So as initiation fee goes up, expectations goes up, and subsidy into food and beverage goes up. If the clubs that have very low or no initiation fee are setting low expectations, and those are the ones, frankly, that are driving towards food and beverage profit, because they're delivering lower, I wouldn't say low, I'll say lower expectations. That was a little bit of a sidetrack, but it is ultimately math, and this is this club's labor cost. It's a few points above the median. They have 7 F&B outlets, So it's a busy operation. That's how they get to 1.8 million. And as we know, driving this down, there's a direct correlation of the service you deliver relative to this ratio. And I was speaking somewhat in jest around how simple it is to make profit, but that's the math behind how you do it. It's not the right thing to do for a club or the membership or value, for sure. Here's an interesting one. Here's also a sign of them driving of this thread line of the club's not producing enough capital income, therefore it looks to operations, therefore it squeezes all expenses, therefore it's driving value out of the services that they deliver to their members. And I suspect this is one of those. I mean, it's extremely unusual to have a club run at a 33% food cost. It's, you know, there is deep convergence around the middle at this, you know, 40, 41, 42, 43 cost of food. And so I'd have to ask, you know, in this case, is this indicative of impact? They're trying to balance the books on diminishing value proposition, and where does that all end, right? And there'll be some connective data points. We look at that as we continue with the story. Turnover percentage, interestingly, has been creeping up over the last year or so as they've been doing this, and now it's up to 7%, already a bit high, and clearly, as your turnover rate goes up, there needs to be an intensification of focus on value. How do we make sure our members are seeing value out of the club? If you take that and you turn it into deeper and deeper cost control because you're losing dues revenue, I get how it happens, but it's you're digging. You know, the rule one: when you're digging yourself into a hole, stop digging. And so, you know, this squeeze down of removing value by driving out expense, because expense is tied to value, you know, especially when it's member amenities, you're going counter to what needs to be done. So this club's had an increasing turnover ratio. Let's look at its full member equivalence, right? So this has been on a downward trend, obviously not positive over the last few years. And the blue line are in their initiation fee. Their initiation fee has been diminishing. So I hope everybody on the webinar is starting to understand how you have to look at the whole club in context, how we're using this specific club as a case study to tell the story of what's completely going on inside the club, and to now start to understand, and even boards start to understand when we go through this with them, that it is kind of a ridiculous question. Now, how do we make money in food and beverage? Because there are much bigger issues than that, and we'll connect to that in a minute. You know, you've all I think seen this chart. We saw this chart. This is that net income or loss as a percentage of gross profit. We know 3/4 of the clubs lose money, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. A few clubs make a little bit, and you know, that's a ridiculous contribution when it does fold into play. What this ultimately about is the theme. One of the themes behind this is if you want the strongest. This is a definitive statement, and I should probably back off that a little bit, but putting the most value into the food and beverage operation delivers the most value. So you know, trying to treat it like the restaurant down the street delivers a restaurant experience. Treating it like a club experience is a different level. And this chart is great for, I think, representing the way the marketplace has spoken around that. So all we've simply done is we know cost of food is, you know, roughly the same club to club. You can drive it down, and you can see the clubs here, Group C, where they're trying to drive profit, Group A with deep subsidy, which tends to be the healthier clubs. What's a couple attributes of those clubs, right? The clubs with deep subsidy, cost of food is 45. The clubs with deep subsidy, with profit, driven it down to 38. Now, I'd argue in a lot of places there's a quality factor of that. Labor ratio, 82% for the deep subsidy clubs, 54%, almost at the 50 that I talked about for the clubs that are making money. So that's what they're doing. They literally have driven the service and quality out of the operation in order to focus on profit. Now, what does the marketplace think about that? Well, what's one great gauge of how the marketplace defines the value proposition of a club? It's initiation fee. These clubs have an average initiation fee of $14,000. These clubs have an average initiation fee of $15,000. So now we're not just talking about data, we're not just talking about context, but we're actually applying insight by understanding the patterns that emerge by a set of clubs that works and behaves in one way versus a set of clubs that behaves in another way. We won't worry about this chart for now. So this is a fun one. Now let's circle back. I should have covered this up. Let's circle back to that list of data points, right? The 563 loss, the 334 gain. I did this at BMI again. And everyone in the room raised their hand that, you know, my board would want to be the $334,000 gain club. Well, let's look at this club versus that club. The club with the profit has a $1,000 initiation fee, a dues ratio of 33%, meaning 33 cents of every dollar comes from dues, a capital ratio of 5%, highly anemic, and a turnover rate of 20% of full members. The club with a deep subsidy, we'll call it, or deeper. Deep depends on, I don't know what their gross profit is, so I can't say deep. I'll just say higher value loss. $37,000 initiation fee, 47% dues ratio, basically in the middle. They're capital rich, 22% capital ratio, and they've got a right down the middle of the industry, actually slightly better, 5% turnover ratio. So I said, now that we've got this chart in play, which one of these clubs would your board members vote to be? Obviously, everybody's hand went up, completely changed their answer from the bottom of the list to the top of the list and say, we would want to be this club that has the $563,000 loss in food and beverage, because clearly it's a club that's got a much higher value proposition and is in a much, much healthier state. And it's that healthy state that enables the club to have the $500,000 food and beverage loss. It's the unhealthy state where you have to treat the operation like a restaurant is where you force yourself to drive the $334,000 gain. That's really fundamental to see, and this is a great way to just think about it. Financial results in food and beverage reflect a club's financial position. They don't drive it. And please, to everybody, whether your members are, you know, club benchmarking members or not, don't go into this trap. It is a trap of list out the numbers and then don't apply any context to it and let's decide which one we want to be, because literally look at the decision that would be made by following that path. I mean, think about the damage. If you were in a healthy zone, maybe you were somewhere, you know, around here, kind of right in the middle, think about the damage you would do to the club if you then took on an effort to drive the club down into this position. I'm not saying food and beverage profit's always bad, but there's clearly a theme here and a set of patterns, and you know, treating every single amenity in the club as high value is critical. It doesn't matter whether it's golf, tennis, food and beverage. You know, no one looks at golf as a standalone business. No one looks at tennis as a standalone business in the club. And looking at food and beverage as a standalone business has the same pitfalls. You have to look at all in context with insight. And luckily now there's a way to do that, and there's a lot of data out there to do that. And obviously we can help any of our members, you know, get there. So let's I want to jump to what should this club be focused on, right? We're going to skip this. We're going to jump right to this. So if we summarize what we learned, not about looking at the list of food and beverage results, but looking at the full story of the club, what do we see? It's got a solid dues engine. We know its capital income is light. It's holding spending below norms. I don't know, but I would argue that over time clearly would have a member impact. It's doing that, thus driving an operating surplus in order to kick it over to the capital side, right? So they're trying to take what is fundamentally a capital problem, and they're actually driving it into becoming an operational problem, and I think a satisfaction problem. There is actually some opportunity, especially since this is primarily a golf club, on driving some more contribution margin out of golf. It is very amenity centric on golf. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And its food and beverage is right smack at the median. It has a subsidy of 3%. By the way, they have about, it was roughly 450 full member equivalents. This $76,000 loss that they're all worried about is $179 per member. It's a trivial amount of money. It's not significant in any way, shape, or form.
Russ, can you very quickly explain the full member equivalent calculation? We have a question about that and whether that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Full member equivalent is very simple. Anybody could do it off the top of their head. It's the total dues revenue collected by the club divided by what a full member pays. And it's the way we normalize member counts so that if you had a social member that paid, 1/5 of the amount of dues, then 5 socials ends up becoming 1 full member equivalent. So it's just a way to normalize those member counts. So operationally, basically, the club is doing fine. Although the fact that they're driving that expense down is a problem. But that's the result is if they left that in and broke even, they would bring that expense spending back up to kind of where it would be. Their expenses and their gross margin would be about the same. So that's the only real problem in play. But we saw their initiation fees are decreasing, and their capital income, organic capital income, is light. And so when you look at this and you say, what should this club, they've asked the question, right? They believe it's a strategic question. They believe they've asked a strategic question, as silly as this sounds. Why don't we make money in food and beverage like McDonald's does, right? In the world of strategic versus non-strategic questions, I would say now that we have told the story of this club, I think the strategic questions would maybe be, why is our membership decreasing? Why is our initiation fee decreasing? Do we generate enough capital to meet our needs? Do we have any opportunity to drive revenue in with margin, right? We talked about golf. If they do want to try to drive more in because they are light on capital and they are therefore looking for cash. That's not an irrational thing, right? To say, hey, can we bring in more marginable revenue? The problem is they of their quote unquote 3 product lines, they're looking at the one that has a negative margin as the way to try to generate margin, as opposed to looking at the 2 they have to say, how do we drive those harder? Are we focused on value creation or expense control? Those are all pretty darn strategic questions, and those aren't, while some of them every club should ask, these questions I didn't come up with generically. I said these are the questions that are the strategic questions for this specific club. Now that we've looked at this, told the story of the club with context. Obviously, we don't make money in food and beverage, like McDonald's does. I would argue that the impact of every one of these questions, when effort is put into it, is high. We know the impact of this, right? It's 76,000, plus whatever they think they should be making on the profit side. It's absurd, though. If you answer the question with a plan of why is our membership decreasing, why is our initiation fee decreasing, all these, does it swamp the potential value of answering this question? Of course it does, because these questions all have a directional path towards increasing of value to membership, right? Every one of these does. This question has a directional path of decreasing value to the membership, because to drive profit out of food and beverage, you have to decrease value, either by chopping out labor or chopping out the quality of the food, right? That's the only 2 ways you're going to get there. So answering the strategic questions actually sort of makes this a moot point to begin with. And this really is the rubber hits the road chart around that jujitsu move of redirection. I know it's hard. Look, I mean, the reality is what reality is. If you have a food and beverage hawk, I still believe that the only way through that is through education on what actually matters, as opposed to hitting it head on, just fighting it that doesn't matter. You gotta prove and show them, explain the business that it doesn't matter. So that's really important, and it has impact. I feel a little bit obligated. Hey, if you're gonna go at the food and beverage thing, what would this club do? Because we didn't look at a couple charts, but there were a couple charts. This is not the right path, but the first thing I'd say is let's at least apply context to the data. So our I'd love to be in that boardroom where they're looking at, $76,000 and a list of other clubs, and then ask the question, okay, our subsidy equates to $179 per member annually. Is that meaningful, right? Is that really a meaningful number? That if we solve that, quote unquote, solve that problem, we've changed the direction of the club. Now, if you want to work on that number, hey, you want to get closer to break even, I ran one chart. It showed their service charge was at 15%. It's 3 points below the norm. Okay, a la carte service charge to all the members going up 3% from 15 to 18%. That'd bring in another 30K. Your beverage prices. Look at their beverage prices. This is a beverage basket. It's very much convergence around $40 for this whole basket of beverages, and they're at $30. So, their food and beverage prices are frankly 20% below the norm. All right, you want to work on food and beverage? Let's get to the medians, right? Raise the beverage prices 20%, and you just found $70,000 there. I would personally, I'd say even better assess that opportunity in golf potentially, because, I don't think this is the right path, but I sort of felt a little obligated to at least use data to say, if you were going to go down this path, how would you do it intelligently with context, not just, going at it willy-nilly. But ultimately, this is about adding context and insight and shifting the discussion. F&B is no more a standalone business than it is in golf, tennis, as I said earlier. And look, this is critical. This stuff is mission critical. There are all of there are GMs that don't survive these food and beverage battles in this industry, right? They get the food and beverage hawk and they don't survive it. We have to fix that problem. We can't allow this to continue happening. And we've been doing it for 6 years, and we're going to keep doing it. And this is great because we're hitting 80, 90 people in one shot. Trying to move it all in the right direction together. But that's everything I have. I had one more slide here around this value creation culture versus cost cutting culture. I don't want to take any more time because we're already at about 45 minutes, and I do want to give it a little bit of a chance for questions. But in this spirit, there is a pattern of clubs that are living in the value creation culture, and there are patterns of clubs that live in the cost cutting culture, and you can't get out of the cost-cutting culture by being really good at it, because that just drives you deeper into it. You have to make a decision to say, we're not going down this path anymore. We're whatever it takes. We're investing. We're, in the case of this club, right? We didn't focus on it, but there's a serious question around, hey, we're a golf's-only club. In this day and age, with everything we've all read and we intuitively know about people wanting amenities other than golf, should we be investing in facilities other than golf, right? Pool, tennis, fitness, whatever you think that is. That's a big strategic question, far bigger, and that alone, gets to the dues, gets to the initiation fee, gets to the whole thing, right? The McDonald's question becomes complete nonsense when sat next to the question of, are we relevant to our community as a golf-only club? That's a big question, and those are the questions that need to be asked. That's part of the redirection, and there's a little finesse in all that, but it's really important. So that's it. We'll end there, and I did go a little over as always, but there's a lot to talk about in this webinar, and I hope it was again, there's not a silver bullet, but it's educate all of us, educate GMs, educate boards, and it's a process, not an event. So Terry, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. If not, I should have mentioned up front, this will be archived. And so probably within a day or so, it'll be up on the clubbenchmarking.com public site. Anybody can go to it under resources and video library.
So we don't have any questions. I will be emailing a link to anybody who registered as well, so you can rewatch the video and share it. And as always, if you're a Club Benchmarking subscriber and you want to discuss this further and look at your own data in the platform with assistance, please don't hesitate. Send an email to support@clubbenchmarking.com or directly to Russ at the email on the screen. But further, even if you're not a subscriber and you want to have a conversation and just take a look, we're taking, we do an annual industry survey, and so we're taking that data in, And as a benefit of participating, we'll do an online benchmark review session with you and take a look at the real data in the system. And you can send an email to info, I-N-F-O, at clubbenchmarking.com if you want to learn more about that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. And have a great day. And we'll talk to you all soon, I hope. Thank you very much.